Several years ago, I noticed that the collected works of Martin Luther, translated into English, were missing one book that was included in the German edition, which of course is the original. That book was called Vom Schem Hamphorash. Vom is German, it means of the, and Schem Hamphorash is Hebrew, meaning the hidden name. I wondered why that book was not included in the American translation, and then called the Lutheran Society, who told me they preferred the book not be translated. I did translate it in any event, and I recognized that American Lutherans are embarrassed about this book because it is a direct assault on the Jewish religion, but in addition to that, also includes Luther's contempt for Catholics and other Protestants. He evidently was unwilling to let anyone else have the kind of freedom of religion that we assume in the United States to be everybody's right. In any event, I translated the Schem Hamphorash. A good part of it is left in Latin. When Luther quoted someone who wrote in Latin, he left it that way. He also quoted some Hebrew prophets and left that in Hebrew. Almost the entire book is written in a German of the 16th century, as Luther did this work sometime in the early part of the 16th century. Luther was born in 1483 and died in 1546, so he evidently did this around 1510, 1515 or so. And so the antiquated German is a bit of a problem. It was necessary to first learn what some of these ancient words really meant. The sum of the book from Schem Hamphorash is, for one thing, an attack on Judaism. It is it differs from the kind of anti-Semitism that one encounters today, and that was the Nazi version. Since it is not based on race, it's based on religion, Luther was willing to accept Jews who had converted to Christianity, his brand of Christianity, of course, whereas anti-Semites will not accept anyone who has a Jewish ancestry on so-called racial grounds. Nevertheless, Luther advocated that synagogues be burnt down, that Jews be driven out of Germany, that Jews be forced into his brand of Christianity, and he quotes at length numerous early church fathers who already in the first century participated in all kinds of anti-Jewish statements and diatribes. The book, I show in the book that the opinions of Luther were not new with him. They began in the very first century, when the earliest Christians, who were of course Jews, had accepted the new religion. A good number of them became absolutely infuriated because their erstwhile religious brethren, the majority of Jews, refused to become Christians. Most important among the writers of that day was a Jew named Barnabas. He had no other name. Barnabas wrote a most vicious anti-Jewish diatribes, making all kinds of accusations, including calling Jews Christ killers and other hateful hateful kinds of characterizations. And when you trace the history of anti-Jewish behavior in Europe over 1900 years, you find that what Barnabas wrote in the first century was repeated over and over again, so that by the time Luther wrote from Schem Hamphorash, he was actually repeating what he had heard when he was still a Catholic monk and what had been repeated for centuries before. One of the consequences of Luther's hatred and hateful writings was that it became part of German literature. It entered into novels, songs, poetry, and general public opinion. Luther was, after all, at first a Catholic monk, so he had heard a lot of this anti-Jewish hatred in his own Catholic Church. When he founded the Lutheran religion, he continued this, particularly since he was terribly disappointed when the Jews would not follow him. In his early life, shortly after he had organized, or he had become the father of Protestantism, after 1517, he believed Jews would become Christians because of the Protestant revisionism that he had organized in Germany. Luther began his Protestant ministry in 1517 when he published on the church door of Wittenberg 95 so-called theses or objections to Catholicism. It was not his intent at that time to begin or start a new religion. He wanted to revise or reform Catholicism, but the church would not listen to that. They excommunicated him. They drove him out, and so he moved to Wittenberg, where the Prince of Wittenberg protected him against being burnt at the stake by the Catholics. In Wittenberg, at first, he wrote a pamphlet favoring Jews because he believed that by leaving Catholicism, the Jews would now become Christians according to his version. He said in that new pamphlet that he said, had I been a Jew, I would have never become a Catholic Christian because of the brutality with which they treated the Jewish people. But now, claimed Luther, I am inviting the Jews to the new version of Christianity, and he actually expected them to convert to him. When that didn't turn out to be the case, he became incensed with anger, and he first wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which in fact does exist in English, but from Schem Hamphorash did not. And so I translated that. The book actually has more material than just the discussion of the Jews. But not only do I have the translation of from Hamphorash in a book, but I wrote numerous chapters, number of chapters, showing, tracing the history of relationship of Jews to Christianity since the first century. The book deals with the early Christian theologians, and it also discusses such famous scholars in Christianity as Erasmus, whose name, of course, was not Erasmus. Erasmus is Latin, meaning a loving person. His real name was Gerhard Gertz. And Erasmus, of course, also insulted and anti-Jewish diatribes. I then continue to show that Luther's follower, Calvin, in English, John Calvin, a French theologian, in his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was a vast volume leading to the development of the Calvinist and Presbyterian Church, also participated in his rejection of Jews. The Calvinism, of course, became the origin not only of the Scottish Presbyterian Church, but also of the New England pietists, or in many, or the Pilgrims who came from England and settled in Massachusetts and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was entirely Calvinistic. So this anti-Jewish diatribe continues in Calvin's work. I then show how this kind of material enters into all European literature. It's visible in Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, which is without question a caricature of Jews in the form of Shylock. Now, in Shakespeare's day, Shakespeare was born in 1546. In Shakespeare's day, there were no Jews in England because King Edward I had driven all the Jews out of England at the end of the 11th century. There had not been a Jew in England in 400 years, yet Shakespeare pretended to know what Jews are all about and make Shylock into a malicious caricature. It is said that Adolf Hitler thought that The Merchant of Venice was his favorite play. So this sort of thing went into British literature, into English literature. In English literature, it traveled into American literature. And of course, in all of European literature, by reason of Luther in Germany, Calvin, who was French, in the French-speaking literature, in all of European literature, you get these caricatures of Jews, which finally became one of the reasons for the Holocaust. I show then that after the Holocaust, an effort was made to develop a new Christian theology concerning Jews. This was not universal. Even after the Holocaust, there were theologians, Christian theologians, who continued this kind of religious diatribe. However, the most significant was the ecumenical council, which met in the Vatican in 1960, called Vatican II. It's called Vatican II because there was also a major Vatican Council that met in 1898 in the Vatican. Well, Vatican II was called by the Pope, and its purpose was to revise Catholicism altogether, but one of its principal consequences was a declaration by the Vatican, at the time by the bishops and church leaders who met there concerning the relationship of Jews, of the Catholic Church to Judaism. This was called in Latin Nostra Aetate, which are the first two words in the Latin version of that declaration. Nostra Aetate in English means in our time. And it then it discusses how in our time the Catholics see the whole world in a different light, and that now the Church was willing to accept Jews as equals, and it then even went so far as to argue that the old Christ killer stories were not in light, not consonant with Catholic teachings, and that the death of Jesus was a sin for all human beings, and that it was illegitimate to blame Jews then or living now for the death of Jesus. That, of course, in a sense, from a Jewish point of view, is uncalled for, since there was never a Jew in this world who had anything to do with that. Nevertheless, it was welcomed because the belief that Jews are Christ killers was always a reason for persecution. So the Catholic Church made an effort here to rid its theology of that kind of belief. Nostra Aetate was a much lengthier kind of statement, and it then provoked Lutherans and other Protestants to make similar statements. For example, the Lutheran Church in July 1983 promoted a declaration called to clarify position on anti-Semitism of the Lutheran Church, which denounced anti-Semitism absolutely and distanced themselves from the writings of their founder, Martin Luther, concerning Jews. As a result, all Protestant denominations that I could find made statements denouncing anti-Jewish hatred, particularly since by that time, after the Second World War, the horrors of the persecution between 1933 and 1945 became worldwide, known everywhere. It's simply impossible for anyone today to claim they doesn't know anything about it. It's on television all the time, and the Protestants and Catholics both knew it. The consequences of this were that more or in America, in any event, this made a good deal of difference. If we today look at public opinion in the United States concerning Jews, a very recent Gallup poll shows that over 90% of Americans are perfectly willing to have a Jewish president. What is peculiar about this is that the Gallup listed numerous Christian denominations as well as Judaism and asked the question, would you be willing to have a president by this from any one of these religions or denominations? And to my absolute surprise, over 90% of Americans said it made no difference to them if a Jew became president, whereas Catholics and various Protestant denominations fared less well. Most Christians evidently are less willing to have a Christian president than a Jewish president. Another question that was asked was, what is your view of Israel? A vast majority of Americans view Israel favorably. Another question on the Gallup poll was, what is your view of Judaism as a religion? Almost all the answers were favorable. In other words, what has happened was that the rejection of these medieval hatreds of Judaism, which were involved in found in all English-speaking literature, the rejection by Christian denominations, and particularly the Catholic Church, has definitely worked in this country. This is not true in Europe. In Europe, the anti-Jewish behavior continues. It's not that there are gas ovens or concentration camps, but the 1,400,000 Jews who live in Europe among 750 million Europeans, a tiny, tiny minority, these Jews continue to have nothing but trouble all over Europe on the part of people who blast their hatred on and who cannot tolerate the sight of so much as one Jew. So there's a huge difference between the Jewish development in this country and in Europe. I attribute that to the American democratic tradition, as well as the civil rights movements of the 1960s, the huge effort to do something about minorities, the hope to include everyone, which is part of American ethos today, so that Jews have indirectly profited immensely from this belief that all men are created equal, as the preamble to the Constitution says. I think another reason for the acceptance of Jews in America is that Jews have been very successful here. There are many Jewish, 50% of all American billionaires are Jewish. There are Jews in government, Jews everywhere, even though we are only 1.8% of the population. And success is usually rewarded with approval. In Europe, Jews are nobodies, always have been. And therefore, the worse somebody is off, the poorer people are, the weaker they appear, the more enemies they have. People don't attack the powerful, they attack the weak. In sum, the Jew and Christian Theology, as McFarland Publishers called my book, is published now in a second edition. It evidently sold very well, particularly since most theological seminaries, both Catholic and Protestant, evidently acquired the book in their libraries, particularly since any seminary, any Christian seminary, would want to have all the books of Martin Luther. This is the only source for the Schem Hamphorash.